Hi guys, my name is Brian. I'm a science teacher. I am also a recovering addict who has been on and off of benzos and opioids for 15 plus years, currently tapering off of methadone maintenance, and I'm the author of the Concrete Confessional Addiction and Recovery blog, where we talk about the intersections between recovery and pop culture, law, policy, current events, art, anything that has to do with addiction and recovery. So today I'm talking about photographer Mark Lada's YouTube series Soft White Underbelly, and why, even though I started out as a cautious fan, I don't support the project or view his videos anymore. So specifically, I'm going to be talking about issues of consent. I'm going to be talking about how he approaches underage interviewees. I'm going to be discussing the fundraising aspect of what he does and why I think that his approach to that is definitely problematic. And I'm also going to be discussing the narratives that he pushes, whether consciously or not, when it comes to things like how trauma holds us back and defines us, when it comes to things like, we'll say, adult work of various types and how much money people can make from them, and a couple of other narratives that I find very prevalent and in his videos that I think are actually very damaging and potentially even dangerous. So for those of you who don't know much about Soft White Underbelly, again, it is a YouTube series that has millions of subs at this point. It is created by a photographer named Mark Lada. Now, Mark has a lot of commercial success. He was one of the lead photographers for Apple. He had sort of pioneered this high saturation rainbow aesthetic that is very prominent in a lot of their campaigns for like the classic iMac and iPhone campaigns. And he also created this series earlier on in his career called the Created Equal series. So this was a really cool set of photographs that are called diptychs, which just means one photograph kind of next to each other for maximum contrast. And in that series, he would compare, like, say, a janitor and a CEO. And through posture and dress and background, he would drive home the point that, okay, these people who society tells us are so different are really just both human beings at the core. And so, again, one example is a janitor compared with a CEO. Another example might be like, a Mormon man with his sister wives compared with a pimp with his girl. So these are, kind of jarring comparisons, but I actually think that the Created Equal series was beautiful, and I can see in it the seeds of the Soft White Underbelly project. So for the past several years, Mark has devoted himself, as far as I know, exclusively to the Soft White Underbelly project, and if I had to summarize it in just a line or two, it's basically giving the viewer insight into the margins of society, sort of the fringes of society. So all of these underworlds or these subcultures, so like BDSM, different fringe religious and spiritual communities, maybe adult work and sex work of various types, just all kinds of interviews with people telling stories that you're not likely to run across in mainstream American society. And the other thing to know about this, which I touched on very briefly before, is that there's a fundraising component to it. Mark has a general GoFundMe to raise money for his interviewees, and he has also had at different points specific GoFundMes for specific purposes for certain interviewees. So that's kind of the shtick, and he also does a portrait for each interviewee that he talks to. It's usually in black and white, and so at some point in the course of their Soft White Underbelly video, he'll sort of pan from the top of that portrait all the way to the bottom, and you can't fault Mark as a photographer. These are brilliant, brilliant pictures of some really charismatic people who are telling incredible stories that oftentimes involve events that most of us probably couldn't even survive. So when I started watching these interviews, I was transfixed, and I started off as a fan. I mean, some people have said that they find Mark really creepy, and that wasn't my experience. I found him, if anything, just kind of boomer coded. He would say some things that were a little bit old-fashioned or awkward, but I didn't sense any harm in it. In fact, I sensed a lot of earnestness. I really loved getting a glimpse into those subcultures that I had never experienced before. Again, things like nudism, things like maybe traditional religious communities who live in low tech settings, things like the criminal underworld. Although I kind of had some experience with that through my years of addiction. Mark has literally just interviewed mafiosos. He's interviewed hitmen, so that's totally outside of my realm of experience, and I loved it. I was into it to begin with. I also saw that Mark really bonded with some of his interviewees. There's one transgender woman named Rebecca, who's one of his most famous subjects, I guess you could say, and he's had many interviews with Rebecca, and you can tell that they've developed a friendship of sorts. He's totally exasperated by Rebecca. He doesn't think she's doing the things that she needs to do to get her life back on track. Rebecca is using meth. She's got a lot of other mental health issues. She's an illegal immigrant, and Mark is trying to get her on a less self-destructive path, but in between, with all the chaos unfolding, you can tell that he genuinely cares about Rebecca, and that in his own way he's really hoping that things turn around for Rebecca. So yeah, I saw all of that about Mark, and I started off as sort of a fan. However, as time went on, I saw a shift in his interviews. This is really common with YouTube because it's an algorithmic machine that tends to drive creators to chase after clicks, and in order to not just grow their channel, but just to maintain their current level of growth, it tends to encourage more and more extreme content of whatever sort they're producing. So if you've seen this arc, I'm sure if you've been around YouTube for any length of time, you've seen creators go through this arc where they sort of get more, I don't want to just say extreme, I'm trying to think of a better word. It's like they have to get more outrageous, more provocative. They have to do more and more. In his case, he has to find interviewees who are more sort of outrageous or troubled or provocative, so a lot of the nuance and a lot of the subtlety and a lot of the sweetness of some of his early interviewees got completely lost, in my opinion, as the years wound on and he was trying to maintain this machine. And as that shift happened, I realized more and more that the way that he was approaching these interviewees was really problematic, and that's not a word that I've ever used before. Again, I have a blog and I've written extensively about addiction and recovery related issues. I'm not one of those people who says that word in every other sentence, okay? And in fact, again, on the record, this is the first time that I can remember having used it, but I believe that the way that Mark approaches his interviewees is genuinely problematic, and without further ado, I'm going to get into explaining why I believe that. So the first big issue that I see is with consent. So many of Mark's interviewees are people with substance abuse problems. There are at least 10 or a dozen interviews where the person tells him point blank during the interview that they are under the influence of a powerful mind-altering substance, and Mark is paying them for these interviews. It's a really important thing to realize that they're not doing this, the interviewees aren't doing this only because they want to get their stories out there. They're being compensated for it. So if you've ever been addicted or you've ever been around an addict, you know that on those bad days when we are sick, we will do anything to get money. We will say and do almost anything to get our next fix. And so Mark is interviewing these people, and he's been criticized as producing what people call trauma porn, which I think is a good way to characterize the lowest quality content, the sort of most gutter level stuff that he produces. I'm not saying all of his interviews are that, but at their worst they can be that. And he's basically sitting down with these people who are in the hardest days of their life. They're homeless, they are hungry, they are just trying to get through today and maybe even not wanting to wake up tomorrow. And what Mark essentially does is tells them, tell me the worst thing that ever happened to you and I'll give you enough money that you can get high for today. That's pretty much what it boils down to. Again, tell me about the worst things that have ever happened to you. Tell me about them in the most animated, sort of provocative way that you can, and I'll make sure that you're high for today. So Mark claims that, or he has claimed that if one of his interviewees decides that they don't want their interview up for, forever, they want it taken down, that he will do that for them. Now, that is only partially effective. It's really not effective at all, actually, because as we all know, once something is up on the web, it's up forever. And these interviews get hundreds of thousands or millions of views. They are, copied and pasted all over the web. And once it's out there, it can't be taken back. But even more than that, I want to talk about a couple of case studies that show that even though Mark says that that is his policy, he doesn't actually do that, which I think is awful and one of the worst things about how he's doing what he's doing. So the first sort of case is an adult star named Charlotte Sins, okay? She talks about when she's doing the Holly Randall Unfiltered podcast, she talks about how her interview with Mark was one of the most awkward, regrettable experiences of her entire career. She talks about how uncomfortable she met. She also talks about how when she met Mark asked her not to mention that she's an adult film star. He told her, oh, I've already interviewed a bunch of adult film stars, so can you just please pretend that you're just a cam girl at this point, because she had done webcamming in the past. But the thing is, Charlotte Sins has a good friend who was also interviewed by Mark, and that friend ended up regretting the interview as well, requesting it taken down, and just radio silence from Mark. Mark never got back to them, and their interview is still up. So that is also borne out by something that I heard about. So I wrote an article on my blog about some of the thoughts, sort of like the early version of the thoughts that I'm sharing today. And I was contacted by someone who was the former partner of an interviewee who Mark had interviewed in his early days. Now, this woman ended up dying of an overdose. She had a really bad addiction problem. And again, it was her former partner who she had been with on and off for years who ended up getting in touch with me. Now, that person shared direct correspondence between Mark and the surviving partner of this interviewee. Mark was really annoyed with this person, and I will say he used borderline abusive language. He was telling this person, you are just like everybody else. You want to criticize how I'm doing this, but you're not there with $50 to give this person. You're not there with a hotel room for them. So until you're willing to do as much as me for them, just shut the hell up. Now, mind you, this person had literally gone into major debt to help this person who I'm talking about, the interviewee who had died. They had spent literally tens of thousands of dollars of money that they didn't have to try to get them into treatment, to try to save the life of them, and to rescue the child who was brought into this situation unwillingly by the interviewee at some point. And, Mark was just totally disrespectful to them. And in the course of this communication, I'm bringing it up because this person also referenced that Mark had not taken down the video when the interviewee ended up requesting that Mark take it down. And, Mark essentially in his reply acknowledged that that was the fact and said, too bad, and you know what, she's not around anymore. So, you can't even prove that she wanted it taken down. So Mark says that he's going to take these interviews down, but there are multiple credible people who say that he absolutely does not know that. He doesn't do that if you end up requesting it. So that's one of the things I want everyone to know. If you're going or considering on going on Softboy Underbelly and you think, hey, if the interview doesn't go well, I can take the money and I can tell Mark, just take it down. Like, no, we have credible evidence that Mark doesn't take it down, even though he promises that in the beginning. And I think that that is super underhanded and repulsive, frankly. I think that it's repugnant. People who are out of their mind on substances, whether they're in withdrawal or they're actively intoxicated at that moment, they can't consent. I don't want to approach this mainly as a legal issue, because I think even more than that, it's an ethical issue, it's a decency issue, but it is a legal issue. I think about things like that Girls Gone Wild series, that softcore series where, they would find girls on spring break and they would give them, $40 to flash their boobs, right? And that series, I remember, it ran into trouble because a lot of these girls were intoxicated at the time that they made these videos. And even though these producers for the show had proper paperwork showing that these girls were supposedly consenting to the interviews, it was very clear, not interviews, but you know what I mean, consenting to being filmed, being wild. It was very clearly held by the courts that that is not good enough, that if someone isn't in the right frame of mind, if they're really intoxicated when they're signing those papers, they are not valid. So if I were Mark, I would be expecting at some point, some kind of legal problem from this. I mean, on the one hand, the people who he interviews are at such a power disadvantage. You know, you're talking about homeless people, you're talking about people who don't have even money to feed themselves. So these aren't people who are probably knowledgeable in being plaintiffs in the court system, the civil court system, let's put it that way. They might be very familiar with the criminal court system, but they're two very different worlds, and they're certainly not people who are going to have money to take on Mark and all his privilege and power. So yeah, I think that this issue of consent is one of the biggest worries about Softway Underbelly, and from what I've seen and heard, Mark is really not doing it too well, and eventually I predict that he's going to have problems by that. You can only sort of poke the beast for so long before the right confluence of circumstances blows up in your face. And if what I've heard about how Mark deals with these interviews, especially with takedown requests, is true, frankly, I think he kind of deserves it.